Welcome to Journeys Through Sociology, a series of interviews with the Executive Committee of the International Sociological Association. I'm Lalebe Bohanyan, and our guest today is Professor Jennifer Platt, who is joining us from Brighton, England. Professor Platt is an Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Sussex, where she taught for almost 40 years. Among her numerous research projects, she's particularly focused on the history of sociology, the history of its institutions and methodological approaches. Professor Platt is not only highly active in a number of sociological associations, but she's also undertaken the task of writing their institutional histories. So not only has she served as the president of the British Sociological Association, but she also wrote its official history. Her many publications also include a history of the ISA, and she served as the president of its research committee on the history of sociology, as well as serving as the chair of the American Sociological Association section on the history of sociology. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Platt.
Thank you.
So, Professor Platt, we'd like to start today just by having you perhaps give us a little bit of a sense of some of the work that you're currently doing. So what would you say, what aspect of your work are you currently most excited about right now?
Well, I'm at a very nice stage in one area of work. I'm avoiding calling it project because it isn't as formed as a project. I'm at the wonderful stage when you see a lot of possibilities opening out in front of you, and you haven't yet gone through the dirty work of actually implementing them. What this actually consists of is, because I was writing a paper on defining the boundaries of sociology, what one had to write about if one was writing its history, that I took as an example of an interesting, somewhat marginal career, the late, great Michael Young, whose name you may or may not be familiar with. It doesn't matter. But he's quite an interesting borderline character in relation to sociology. And I took all the acknowledgements of his first sociological book, and I tracked down where those contacts were. And I found I could plot where those contacts had come from in terms of his history. And thinking about that, I realized I could define his sociological world, and I could define other people's too, and I could look where they overlapped. And also that I could look into the history of the publisher that published his works, which was a very important sociological publisher that mysteriously nobody else has yet looked at. So I see all these lovely, enticing paths leading away into the middle distance, and quite soon I shall go down at least one of them.
Okay, so this all began out of a paper that you were writing on defining the boundaries, where you looked at the context and the acknowledgement of Michael Young's work. But what do you plan for the larger?
No. The boundaries were meant to be the question of defining where sociology stops and other things start that you might not wish to look at if you're going to do the history of sociology. I mean, on the whole, I believe in going wide, although I've gone wide to varying degrees in different projects.
Right. So this is a way of really thinking about the boundaries of sociology by thinking of those areas of
Well, that's what it started as, but now I'm thinking of the social structure of sociology, where different people in it occupy worlds of different shapes, which partly overlap and partly don't, and thinking of how to plot that.
So, Professor
Not only by looking, sorry.
I'm sorry, go on. Not only by...
Certainly not only by looking at acknowledgements. There's a lot of other things one could look at, like co-authorships, membership of associations, all sorts of things one could look at. But to fit into that general idea of defining what the sociological world was that they occupied, and therefore what the total pattern is eventually.
So I'm hoping that in this interview we get to hear more about the different kind of research projects that you've done over the years. But can we start by first getting a little bit of a sense of your own history as a sociologist? One of the main questions that we've posed to the various ISA members in these interviews has been the issue of what actually drew them to sociology. And through these conversations, we've been getting a sense of what sociology means to different scholars, the kind of potential that they see in it. So in your own case, what would you say are some of the main reasons that you chose to become a sociologist?
I don't know that I chose to become a sociologist. It sort of happened. I mean, my first degree was in English at Cambridge University, and I was quite involved in that and so on. But I always somehow wanted data about things in a way that wasn't quite the way English degrees were usually structured. Mm-hmm. And at that time, there was a lot of emphasis on life, as I'm making quotation marks, which you maybe can't see on the screen. Life as a criterion for relating to literature. And I realized I'd had a very sheltered life, and I didn't know what there was in life. And I sort of wanted more data about that. Mm-hmm. Then another thing was as an undergraduate, I was involved in the University Liberal Club. Liberal in the British sense, not the American sense, not meaning very left-wing. But this club used to...
Could you actually, I'm sorry, Professor, so could you, for our viewers, could you explain what liberal in the British sense does mean?
It doesn't matter for what I'm going to say.
Okay.
I mean, there's a Liberal Party, which has generally, historically been regarded as a centre party between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. That's a bit misleading, but never mind. Anyway, it was a very minority party at the time, but the point I'm coming to is that they used to run canvassing tours in the vacation, when a group of you would go around knocking on doors and talking to people about the Liberal Party. Mm-hmm. And I saw the way a lot of other people lived who had very different lives from me. Mm-hmm. Well, that was quite a significant experience for me of sort of wanting something more. Well, I mean, sociology was very much in the air at the time. The first American paperbacks, I remember Reisman's The Lonely Crowd had been published and reached England, and those were sort of exciting. But anyway, I went on after I graduated to do a social work course. I didn't know what social work was, but it sort of seemed like something that was quite a good idea. In that social work course, I had a compulsory sociology course. Mm. In the sociology course, I discovered that, counter to popular tabloid myths about working class people going out and wasting National Health Service money by getting 2 sets of false teeth because they didn't have to pay for them, stories like that. Mm. There was empirical research which had demonstrated that, in fact, middle-class people were getting more financial value out of their use of the National Health Service. Mm. And that was so striking to me. I thought, right, that's it. Mm-hmm. I want data. So at that point, I started applying to American universities to go to do an MA in sociology, which was a very common way of getting sociology in those days. Mm-hmm.
So it was, in a sense, I mean, it was your interest in getting data, as you say, and kind of empirical information about the world that drew you to sociology. Can you tell us a bit about some of the early research projects that you engaged in as you first began to work as a sociologist? Well, I can tell you about my MA thesis. That was about perceptions of class structure. And I did this in Chicago, which is where I took my MA course. And I had a sample of people whom I asked various questions about their perception of class structure. And I was very gratified when I found that I could, in fact, construct a chart which showed that where people drew the class boundaries down an occupational hierarchy varied with their own position in it. So that lots of people could call themselves middle class, but they meant different things by it, which you could define by asking them to do an occupational ranking task of a kind that was very conventional at the time. So, you know, that was my very first own project. Professor Platt, the other issue that we've been posing to ISA members is aside from what drew them to sociology, which has given us a sense of kind of the potential they see in it, so in your case, you know, being drawn to data, but we've also been asking them to speak about the challenges that they face as sociologists. And I'd be particularly interested in hearing your insights on this, given that, you know, you're not only a sociologist, but a sociologist who spent many years reflecting on the field of sociology and its institutions and the ways that it works, its methods. So in your own case, though, what would you say have been some of the major challenges you faced as a sociologist?
Well, there's one that, to be perfectly honest, I don't think fits your question very well, but nonetheless, I'm going to tell you about it.
Okay.
I'm not sure now that I realized at the time what a challenge it could be seen as being. But it was when I was doing my Chicago MA thesis. And I was out in the back of the yards area, quite a long way from the university buildings. And I had a quota sample. So it was just people I could find who fitted my quota that I was interviewing, not people specified in advance. Nobody knew that I was out back of the yards that day or where I was going to land up. One of the interviews I did that afternoon was with an elderly man who was going to leave his apartment the following day. The interview took place in a basement area, so people from the outside couldn't see in. We sat at his kitchen table, and he sat between me and the door, playing with a large kitchen knife. Wow. I got out safely.
Wow.
But, you know, so the more I realized what I did then, the more horrific it seems. But anyway, clearly I met that challenge successfully.
Thank God, yes. Yes.
Anyway, something a bit more conventional.
So I hope that you haven't continued to face those kinds of situations.
No, I've never had anything like that again happen, which is very lucky. Yeah, well, moving forward considerably in time, I'd say one of my major challenges came around 1968, when I was a very young member of faculty at Sussex, and the great period of student unrest came. And how to deal with that pattern of behavior there for a member of faculty was very difficult indeed to do. It posed very considerable challenges when I'm not sentimental about what happened in 1968. I don't identify with, I'm not 68 I don't identify with the movement, and you'll see why when I tell you some things. Things that happened to me included things like an occasion when I had a visiting lecturer reaching the lecture theatre and finding someone had written on the board, lecture cancelled. I taught a methods course that was entirely a critical one about published work, talking about how convincing the conclusions were that people had reached on the basis of the material that they had. And in the feedback session at the end, students said, "You're just trying to make bureaucratic technicians of us all, aren't you, telling us how to meet the needs of the state?" But you know, it was exactly the opposite kind of course. And I can tell you a really nasty story. A lot of posters were stuck up by students about the place. There was one with a picture. It was an organogram of the committee structure of, you know, the sort of hierarchy of committees in the university. And graphically depicted, each layer was defecating on the layer below as an expression of attitudes towards committees rather than having general assemblies to decide everything. However, just underneath this was a poster which demanded representation on all committees. I looked at this and I decided rational discussion was appropriate. And I drew a small arrow from one to the other and I wrote, "Is this consistent?" After which one of the leading students said publicly, "And members of faculty are even defacing student posters." Marie Yahuda who you may know was a very distinguished social psychologist who had been left Austria to get away from the Nazis after a spell in detention there, said that some of these things reminded her of what the Nazis did in Vienna. Well, you know, there were a lot of more attractive features, but trying to deal with those things and actually carry on teaching, and when people were disrupting exams as well, you know, it was not easy.
So that would be, so, you know, that would be a second challenge, the first being the situation of having a knife pulled by an interviewee. I'm almost scared to say, what is the third challenge?
It's a nice, cozy one. It's my current role as Vice President for Publications.
With the ISA.
Of the ISA, that's right. Because there is this tension between the purely commercial aspects of what we ask for from our publications, which make an important contribution to our finances, and what one might wish for on purely intellectual grounds. You know, for instance, one can see a commercial argument for a more elitist approach, but an intellectual argument for quite the reverse, and being very open to bringing in new work that isn't necessarily the best, but is interesting and represents different spheres, and so on. And I find continually, in policy terms, trying to think how to work it out, ideally so you can have your cake and eat it.
And so I would imagine that this tension that you're struggling with within the publications within ISA is an issue that faces publications of sociology research more generally. Yes.
Oh yes. I mean, if you're how can I say that? If you are an individual sociologist doing your work, it takes slightly different forms. You know, like, should you try to write something that will maximize your citations rather than, you know, write it the way you would prefer it to be just for its own sake as a problem? That sort of issue certainly arises for most, if not all, individuals.
So, and as we speak about this issue, I mean, one of the things I'd be really interested to hearing about, Professor Platt, is, you know, you have a long history of research on the field of sociology and its institutions, et cetera. And what was it that drew you in the first place to you know, taking sociology as your own subject of research?
I don't know. I mean, the first thing I did, what was the first thing I did? One of the first things I did was, no, I'm sorry, I'm just remembering several different things simultaneously, which is stupid. I think, to be perfectly honest, the first thing I did was because I was annoyed with the way other people made statements that I didn't think were well-founded. And so I set out
about the history of sociology.
No, not necessarily. Sometimes that, or maybe, but it was just about something else that they had studied, but I didn't think was necessarily done in the most appropriate way. So the question is, how come they thought about it like that? How come they did it that way? And the stage when I was starting to do this was the stage when there were a lot of publications that, in the interests of reflexivity, were solicited accounts of how people had carried out their own research. And so I was sort of moving with the crowd, in a sense, in being concerned about that, except that I wasn't just commissioning other people to write stuff. I was writing it after interviewing them and studying their work and so on.
So, and also, you've written a history of the ISA, and given that this is a series of interviews with ISA members, it would be wonderful if maybe you could just share a few of the insights that came out of the work that you did in researching the history of the ISA itself.
Well, I suppose, I mean, one of the insights is, I don't think this is much of an insight because I think it's pretty obvious, actually, but never mind. that you can see how the external circumstances have changed very considerably over time. And so that what started as something that was very much contained within the UNESCO framework, because it was UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Social and Cultural Organization, that set up not just the ISA, but the equivalent in politics and anthropology and so on at the same time, attempting to create a representative structure in which all these things would be brought together to do research that would promote the general welfare and so on. So from being very much contained within the UNESCO setting, and frankly, trying to bring together the world's sociologists, a lot of the world didn't have any sociologists then. And so there were slightly bizarre discussions of how to find somebody who could be deemed to represent the country where there weren't any real sociologists yet. But rapidly, sociology started to expand, and that became no longer relevant at all. There may still be have been different conceptions of precisely what constituted being like a sociologist, but almost everywhere had some. So that kind of aspect died away completely. And sociology expanded so much. I mean, if you look at the first journal that the ISA had, which was Current Sociology, initially it tried to publish each year a list of all the new sociological publications. And it wasn't very fat. Rapidly that died away because it became self-evidently impossible. So you can see this sort of circular process of feedback, in effect, of the changing situation, calling for changes in the way in which ISA had to structure its activities.
So, Professor Platt, there's one final question that I'd like to ask you that we've been asking everyone kind of for fun, in a sense. If you had not pursued sociology, is there something else that you think that you would have been interested in doing?
I've got two answers to that.
Okay.
One's a fantasy answer. I would really like to have been a musician. In fact, when I thought about it, I would like to have been Jordi Savall, who is tremendously charismatic and plays the viol, which is a nice, quiet, subtle, sophisticated instrument, but in groups. Me for Jordi Savall. But being realistic, since I can't sing, I'm not musically competent in any way, except being a very frequent concert goer. But I think I would have done well as a civil servant, preferably in the kind of department where there was to some extent a research orientation, and I would probably have been quite happy there.
Well, Professor Platt, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a really fascinating conversation. It's been wonderful to actually learn a bit more about the ISA, and we really thank you for taking the time to be with us.
I've enjoyed answering your questions. Thank you.
This has been another journey through sociology with Professor Jennifer Platt. We look forward to next time when we'll be joined by Dr. Robert Van Krieken from Sydney, Australia.